Data is the backbone of any technical report. It is the key evidence you present to persuade the reader of your conclusions and show the reader how your work did, or did not, answer the aims and objectives of your report. One way to think about this is to see writing your report as telling a story and the data as illustrating that story. This means it is important to include data that helps tell that story and leave out less relevant data. This doesn't mean leaving out results that go against your story. Imagine you are telling a story about a friend's pet with a funny name. A cat called Doggy, for example. You probably want to include the name of the animal and that it was a cat in your story. You might even want to describe the cat and the owner calling its name for added comic effect. However, you probably wouldn't include what the weather was like when you heard about the cat, as that isn't relevant or funny. It is all about picking the relevant information for the story, so the reader can follow it. Here is a more technical example. Imagine a very simple experiment where you ask 50 people to taste 3 different samples of cheese with different salt contents, low salt, medium salt, and high salt, and say which they prefer. The main conclusion of the experiment, the story, was that people preferred cheese with higher salt content, and that this effect was significantly higher in older people. Having collected information about each participant, you might be tempted to include a table like this. However, readers will find this raw data almost impossible to follow. This kind of raw data is better in an appendix. In the main body of the report, it is more useful to place graphs or tables that illustrate a particular part of the story you are trying to tell the reader. So a table like this would be very helpful to show how overall more people preferred the high salt cheese. A table is perfect as the message is a very simple one. Note, I have included a caption describing the data shown. For more complicated parts of the story, it can be useful to include a graph like this one. This shows how different age groups preferred different cheeses, and that older people liked high salt cheese even more than other groups. Note, in a real report, you'd need to provide some statistical analysis to show this is a significant effect. Again, I have included a caption. One thing to note is that it is good practice not to include a graph and table of the same data, but to pick which illustrates the part of the story you are telling best. To help the reader follow your story, remember to put the data in an order that helps tell that story. It will also help the reader if you say what the graph or table say, so they can see how it fits into your story. This is best done in the text with reference to the graph or table. For example, as the salt content of the cheese increased, so the cheese became more popular with the participants in this study, as shown in Table 2. For some data you collect, it might be better to leave it out entirely. For example, if you collected data on the type of cheese they generally prefer, or the date you ran the test, these pieces of data are less relevant to the story. For these pieces of data, it may be sufficient to say that you measured these, but that you found no significant impact on the overall results. This may require some statistical analysis. Of course, if you notice that on one of your testing days all of the participants preferred the high salt cheese, you might need to check if this is a real effect, and if so, you need to decide what to do with that data. You cannot just ignore data that doesn't fit your story. You either need to change your story or explain the data that doesn't support it. In summary, well-selected data presented in easy-to-read graphs and tables in a logical order makes a report easier to follow and more likely to convince the reader of your story, and so of the conclusions you are making. So think carefully about the story you are telling before you start adding graphs and tables to your report. Finally, a word on the Library Skills Development Team. We are here to support you finding information, referencing and report writing. Please do get in touch via Ask for Help or at University Library Online.